Racist cops taste black elderly man until he's dead, unaware his son is deadliest Army general. Clarence Hall woke to the faint glow of dawn seeping through the thin curtains of his small, creaky-windowed house. The morning air was cool, crisp with the scent of dew settling over his modest garden out front, where rows of azaleas and daisies lined the narrow walkway leading to his door. His knees groaned as he swung his legs over the edge of the bed, joints stiffened by age but never enough to keep him from his daily routine. He rose slowly, the habitual ache in his lower back making its presence known, but he gritted his teeth and pressed forward. It was how he'd always lived, steadfast and resilient, moving through life with the quiet dignity of a man determined to endure. His house was a single-story affair, old but well-kept, nestled in a neighborhood where the hum of everyday life remained steady and familiar. Clarence had spent over 50 years here, watching children grow into adults, then witnessing those adults raise children of their own. It was a place where faces rarely changed, and kindness came as naturally as the turning of seasons. Neighbors would greet him by name during his morning strolls, their words threaded with the fondness owed to a man who had been part of their lives for so long. To them, Clarence was something of a fixture, one of the remaining elders whose stories were layered into the fabric of the community. He brewed his coffee, the scent wafting through the kitchen as he reached for the old tin of sugar with fingers gnarled but steady. The clink of the spoon against ceramic seemed louder than usual, the silence of the house thick and unforgiving. Mornings had never felt so desolate, not since Marcus left. The thought of his son pulled at his chest with a familiar heaviness, the kind that seemed to settle deeper with each passing day. Marcus, his only child, his pride and joy. A man now, far away and tangled in the complexities of military life. Clarence often wondered if it had been his own stories of perseverance and duty that had pushed Marcus down such a path. His son's ambition had always been fierce, a flame that Clarence once believed would carry him to great heights. And it had. Marcus had risen through the ranks with a swiftness that left Clarence's heart swollen with pride and racked with worry. It had been years since Marcus's deployment. The specifics of his assignments were never quite clear to Clarence, the details swallowed up by the veil of official silence and Marcus's own guarded words. Communication had been sporadic, letters growing infrequent until they became a rarity, mere whispers against the void of uncertainty. Clarence clung to the notion that his son was simply too busy, his duties demanding, his responsibilities all-consuming. Still, the ache of not knowing gnawed at him, a dull throb beneath the surface of his thoughts. Clarence carried his coffee to the kitchen table, setting the steaming cup down with care before lowering himself into the rickety wooden chair. It creaked beneath his weight, a sound he'd grown used to over the years. But this morning, the sound felt amplified, each groan of the wood resonating within him. His gaze drifted to the envelope sitting just inches away, its pristine white edge glaring against the faded surface of the table. The letter had arrived days ago, its arrival marked by a sudden and unsettling quiet that had wrapped around him like a shroud. He hadn't opened it. Couldn't. His fingers had hovered over the sharp edge of the envelope's seal more times than he could count, but courage had always slipped away before he could tear it open. He told himself it was better this way, that prolonging the inevitable granted him one more day of hope. As long as the letter remained unread, nothing had changed. Marcus was still out there, alive and well, his duties keeping him from writing as often as Clarence would have liked. Denial was a thin, fragile comfort, but it was all he had. To distract himself, Clarence turned his attention to the view outside the window. The garden, his sanctuary. It had been his solace since his wife passed, a place where his hands could work the soil and his mind could drift. He'd taught Marcus to tend the flowers when he was just a boy, showing him how to coax life from the earth with patience and care. Those lessons had been their language, their bond. Even now, Clarence could almost see Marcus's small hands brushing dirt from delicate petals, his bright eyes alight with curiosity. The memory stirred something deep within him, a longing so acute it left him breathless. His eyes shifted back to the letter, the corner of the envelope bent slightly from where he'd pressed his thumb against it the night before. His hands trembled as he reached for his coffee, lifting the cup to his lips with deliberate slowness. The bitter warmth did little to ease the tightness in his chest. He could almost hear Marcus's voice in his mind, that confident tone layered with the determination of a man who had set his own path. Marcus had always been like that, independent, strong-willed, traits that Clarence had once praised but now feared had driven a wedge between them. But even as his thoughts spiraled, Clarence clung to the hope that the letter held nothing more than routine words, an official acknowledgement that Marcus was safe and well, a formality. He tried to convince himself of this, but the truth loomed like a shadow over his resolve. He let his gaze wander around the room, his eyes catching on the photographs that lined the mantel. Moments frozen in time, Marcus as a boy, his smile wide and unburdened by the weight of the world. Marcus in his uniform, standing tall and proud during his commissioning ceremony. Marcus with his mother, her arms wrapped around him in a fierce, protective embrace. Clarence's throat tightened as he studied those images, memories stitched into the fabric of his life. And yet, for all the years that had passed, the pain of absence had never dulled. He closed his eyes, breathing in slowly as if trying to capture some measure of strength from the air itself. He would open the letter later, just not now, not while his hands trembled and his heart felt like it was caught in a vice. No, he would wait until he found the courage to face whatever news it held. Until then, he would allow himself the luxury of hope, however fragile it might be. The unopened letter remained beside his half-empty cup of coffee, a silent testament to the weight he carried. Clarence stepped outside, the morning chill seeping through his jacket as he locked the front door behind him. The air was sharp, carrying with it the earthy scent of rain from the night before. His hand lingered on the rusted key for a moment longer than necessary, as if his mind needed a nudge to move forward. But the walk to the corner store was part of his routine, a small ritual of normalcy he had no intention of abandoning. His neighborhood was still stirring awake, the hum of distant traffic mingling with the occasional bark of a dog or the scrape of metal against pavement as trash bins were dragged to the curb. Clarence's steps fell into their usual rhythm, his worn sneakers scuffing against the cracked concrete. The sun had barely lifted above the horizon, its pale light spreading unevenly across the rows of houses with their chipped paint and sagging porches. This was a place that had aged as he had, weathered, enduring, yet still clinging to some semblance of pride. He made his way down the sidewalk, nodding his head in greeting to the few neighbors already outside. Mrs. Jenkins across the street, her silver hair tied up in a loose bun, waved at him from her garden where she crouched, hands deep in the soil. Clarence raised a hand in return, their exchange wordless but familiar. He found comfort in these interactions, however brief. They were a reminder that not everything had slipped beyond his grasp. But today, something was off. He noticed it before he even reached the end of the block, a heaviness that settled over the air like a storm waiting to break. His gaze drifted to where two police cruisers were parked at an odd angle near the intersection, their presence unsettling against the quiet of the morning. Clarence frowned. It wasn't unusual to see the occasional patrol car cruising through, but this felt different. Their positioning was too deliberate, like sentinels guarding against some unseen threat. He slowed his pace, his eyes narrowing as he took in the scene. Two officers stood beside the cruisers, their postures rigid, faces set with an alertness that left Clarence's nerves frayed. They were unfamiliar, not the usual officers who made their rounds through the neighborhood. New faces, young, taut expressions that carried no warmth, only a cold professionalism that seemed to veil something else. Suspicion, perhaps. Or worse. Clarence's instincts urged him to turn around, to abandon the trip to the corner store and retreat to the safety of his own home. But the thought of retreating left a bitter taste in his mouth. Why should he change his routine, alter his life, simply because a couple of cops were standing where they shouldn't be? He squared his shoulders and pressed on, his gait steady even as his heartbeat quickened. One of the officers, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a neatly trimmed mustache, glanced up as Clarence approached. His gaze was hard, the sort of look a man gave when he was already prepared to see something wrong. Clarence could feel the weight of that gaze bearing down on him, stripping away the familiarity of his surroundings and replacing it with a chill that seeped into his bones. The officer's name tag read Reynolds. His hand rested casually on his holster, fingers drumming lightly against the grip of his weapon. Clarence couldn't help but notice the way Reynolds' eyes followed him, the suspicion etched into his features as if Clarence's very presence warranted caution. The thought lodged itself in Clarence's mind like a thorn. What had he done to deserve that look? Clarence offered a nod of acknowledgement, his voice coming out gruffer than intended as he wished the man a good morning. Reynolds's reply was little more than a curt nod, his gaze never wavering, never softening. The other officer, younger and wiry with restless eyes, exchanged a glance with Reynolds, their unspoken exchange slicing through the air like a blade. He kept walking, his steps a fraction quicker now, his spine straightened by the subtle indignation brewing within him. He told himself he was being paranoid, that not every glance carried judgment. But the image of Reynolds's hand resting so easily on his holster stayed with him, the implication as clear as if the man had spoken it aloud. The corner store wasn't far, just a few blocks down where the old brick building crouched between a barber shop and a laundromat. But the walk felt longer today, the quiet of the neighborhood stretching uncomfortably thin. Every creak of a porch step or rustle of leaves seemed amplified, the sounds cutting through his thoughts with jagged precision. He tried to shake off the encounter, focusing instead on the list of items he needed to pick up. Milk, bread, a newspaper. Simple things, mundane things. But his mind refused to settle, the encounter with the officers prickling beneath his skin like an itch he couldn't scratch. As he walked, he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Even with the police cruisers now behind him, the sensation clung to him, tightening his muscles with every step. It was as though the morning itself had turned against him, the light now too bright, the air too sharp. He told himself he was imagining things, that his own unease was twisting reality into something far darker than it truly was. But the thought offered little comfort. It had been years since he'd felt the sharp edge of another person's distrust so acutely. His neighborhood had always been his refuge, a place where faces were familiar, and acceptance was a matter of course. But that acceptance seemed fragile now, splintered by the icy glare of a man who had looked at him as though he were a threat. Clarence's steps faltered as the store came into view, the faded awning drooping like a weary sigh above the door. He reached for the handle, his fingers trembling slightly as he pulled the door open. The bell chimed softly, its sound almost drowned out by the relentless thudding of his pulse. He forced himself to breathe, to settle the turmoil swirling within his chest. But even as he moved through the narrow aisles of the store, gathering his items with the precision of habit, he couldn't forget the cold stare of Officer Reynolds. Nor could he dismiss the feeling that his world had tilted in some small but irrevocable way. And try as he might to convince himself otherwise, he knew that when he left the store, the weight of those eyes would still be there, watching, waiting. The days dragged on, each one stretching thin beneath the weight of a tension Clarence couldn't quite shake. It started with the patrol cars, their unwelcome presence like a splinter beneath his skin. Their numbers hadn't exactly multiplied, but their persistence had grown. More and more, the dull gleam of black and white cruisers seemed to frame his neighborhood, their engines humming low and restless from corners where they did not belong. At first, Clarence had tried to dismiss it. Officers came and went. It was their job to patrol, after all. But the longer they lingered, the harder it became to convince himself it was nothing more than routine. They parked in places that made their intentions clear. Unmarked territory staked out with the silent arrogance of authority. And always, it was Reynolds and his partner Carter who appeared most frequently, their faces etched into his mind with the precision of a wound that refused to heal. Reynolds's presence was heavy and invasive, his gaze cutting through Clarence's composure like a blade. Carter was no better. He was shorter, wiry with a nervous energy that seemed to vibrate just beneath the surface of his skin. But where Reynolds' suspicion was cold and calculating, Carter's seemed to burn with a twitchy sort of eagerness, like he was searching for trouble simply to have a reason to snuff it out. They weren't subtle. Their cruisers would be parked just up the street or idling too long near the corner, headlights flaring briefly in the early morning fog before fading into a silent watchfulness. Clarence would catch their figures framed by the metal and glass of their vehicles, eyes tracking his movements with an intensity that left him rattled long after he'd turned his back on them. The neighbors had noticed too. Their concern simmered beneath the surface, bubbling up only in the briefest of comments or worried glances exchanged over garden hedges and front porch steps. Clarence could see the unease in the way Mrs. Jenkins would glance down the street before hurrying inside, her quick nods of acknowledgement increasingly replaced by the hurried closing of her front door. Others murmured quietly when they thought Clarence wasn't within earshot, their voices tinged with the sort of anxious pity that only made him feel more isolated. For all the years he had spent here, the decades of familiarity and kinship, the simple truth was that no one wanted trouble. And trouble was exactly what the officer's presence suggested. The neighborhood was old, its heartbeat slow and steady, a place where change came gradually if it came at all. This disruption, this silent threat dressed in uniform, felt like a sickness creeping in from the edges. Clarence tried to occupy himself with the things that had always brought him peace: his garden, his walks to the store, the few lingering letters he wrote to Marcus despite the silence that answered them. Each day, he'd rise from his bed and force himself through the motions of routine, as if the very act of continuing his life as it had always been would somehow force everything else to fall back into place. But the weight of the unopened letter still loomed over him, a specter that seemed to grow heavier with each passing day. Its presence was a pressure in his chest, a slow suffocation he could never quite shake. And the officers, Reynolds and Carter, their presence only made the feeling worse, their watchfulness a constant reminder that his world was fraying at the edges. Another morning brought another walk to the store, his feet finding the familiar path even as his mind remained tangled in a mess of restless thoughts. He kept his eyes straight ahead, determined not to acknowledge the patrol car parked just down the block. Its engine idled softly, the low rumble threading through the quiet like the growl of some waiting beast. As he approached the intersection, the two officers emerged from their cruiser. Carter's expression was tight, his gaze flicking around as if trying to catch something out of place. Reynolds, on the other hand, looked as if he had all the time in the world, his eyes locked on Clarence with a calm intensity that made his skin prickle. They intercepted him just before the corner store, their presence blocking his path with the casual authority of men who were used to getting their way. Their questions came clipped and cold, laced with the sort of formality that disguised suspicion as simple procedure. There'd been reports of suspicious activity in the area, they claimed. Nothing specific, nothing Clarence could grasp and refute, just vague insinuations wrapped in bureaucratic language. Clarence's voice came out steady, though he could feel the tension coiled in his stomach like a fist. He told them he'd lived here longer than they'd probably been on the force, his words meant to convey both truth and warning. He was no troublemaker. Never had been. His life was simple, his days unremarkable. Gardening, grocery runs, the occasional chat with neighbors who had grown old alongside him. That was all. But Reynolds's eyes held a different story. They stared through him rather than at him, as if searching for something Clarence had hidden away. Carter's gaze shifted uneasily, his fingers twitching at his sides, but Reynolds remained perfectly still, his expression betraying nothing but cool disinterest. A man performing a duty he seemed to relish. When they finally stepped back, their departure was marked by a parting warning, words laced with the sharpness of a knife pressed just against the skin. Clarence watched them go, their figures retreating into the metal and glass shell of their cruiser. But the sense of violation remained, lodged deep within him like a splinter refusing to be removed. His steps felt heavier as he continued on to the store, the bell above the door chiming softly as he entered. The familiar surroundings did little to ease the unease gnawing at him. The clerk's friendly nod barely registered as he went through the motions of collecting the few items he needed. Milk, bread, a newspaper. Mundane things meant to preserve the illusion of normalcy. But as he made his way back home, his gaze couldn't help but drift toward the spot where the patrol car had been. It was gone now, but the memory of it lingered, a chill that clung to his skin despite the warmth of the sun climbing higher into the sky. The officer's contemptuous expressions played over and over in his mind, their words unraveling his attempts at composure. And yet, even then, Clarence tried to convince himself it would pass, that if he just kept his head down, kept to himself, the trouble would eventually drift away like a passing storm. But deep down, he knew better. Trouble had a way of sinking its claws in and refusing to let go. The weight of it all began to press down on Clarence's chest like a vice. Days slipped by, their edges blurred by exhaustion and an ever-present sense of dread. His health, which had once been something he'd prided himself on maintaining despite his age, was now a frail thing, crumbling under the strain of his own racing thoughts. Sleep had become a fickle mercy, retreating from him as if afraid to share the same bed with his nightmares. When it did come, it arrived in fractured pieces, shallow dozes disturbed by the flickering of restless dreams. The dreams were often the same, shadowed figures moving through his house, their presence felt rather than seen. Doors opening and closing with a force that rattled his bones, voices murmuring just beyond his reach, their words tangled in suspicion and disdain. He would wake with his heart thrashing against his ribs, his breathing sharp and ragged, the darkness of his bedroom pressing down like a second skin. But the nightmares were nothing compared to the torment of his waking hours. The officers' harassment had grown more blatant, their disdain transforming into something sharper, something meant to cut rather than simply intimidate. Reynolds and Carter had taken to cruising past his house at night, their headlights sweeping across his windows like searching fingers. The beams of light would linger, tracing the edges of his living room, his kitchen, his bedroom, before gliding away with a cruel sort of patience. It was psychological warfare, carried out with the subtlety of a blade slipping between the ribs. The unspoken message was clear. We see you. We're watching. And there's nothing you can do about it. The knowledge twisted inside Clarence, anger and fear warring within him until he felt frayed at the edges, stretched too thin to hold himself together. He found himself unable to concentrate on the simplest of tasks. His garden, once a place of solace and satisfaction, now felt like a chore he performed out of obligation rather than joy. His hands trembled as he worked the soil, the smooth metal of the trowel clutched too tightly in his grip. His plants were suffering from his neglect, their leaves curling at the edges as if mirroring the turmoil that roiled within him. His appetite had dwindled to almost nothing. Meals became a reluctant ritual, the food tasting like ash no matter how much effort he put into preparing it. Even his treasured cups of coffee brought no comfort, their bitterness only serving to remind him of how hollow his days had become. The letter from Marcus's base remained on the kitchen table, untouched and unopened. Its presence was a constant, silent accusation, a reminder of his own cowardice. Clarence tried to convince himself that his reluctance was based on logic rather than fear. What good would it do to open the letter if it only contained bad news? Better to leave it sealed, to preserve the fragile hope that Marcus was alive and well, simply too busy to write as often as Clarence wished he would. But the truth of it gnawed at him, a raw wound he refused to acknowledge even as it festered. As the days continued their relentless march, Clarence found himself contemplating actions he would have dismissed as absurd only weeks earlier. He toyed with the idea of calling the local police station, of filing a formal complaint against Reynolds and Carter. But the thought of doing so left him paralyzed. What good would it do to voice his grievances to the very institution that had sent those officers in the first place? The fear of retaliation was a shadow that loomed over every thought, its presence as real as the soreness that had begun to settle in his joints. His isolation only made matters worse. The few neighbors who still spoke to him did so with hesitation, their words laced with a pity that felt more like a condemnation. Even the clerk at the corner store had started looking at him differently, his smiles forced and his greetings clipped. The subtle shift in their interactions only deepened Clarence's growing sense of alienation. It was during one of those restless nights, his body curled into the armchair by the living room window, that Clarence caught the familiar glow of headlights sweeping across his lawn. His breath stilled, his fingers digging into the fabric of the armrest as he watched the patrol car crawl past his house. Its movements were slow and deliberate, the engine purring like a predator circling its prey. He wondered if they knew he was watching them, if their performance was meant to be observed and absorbed. His body ached from the strain of holding himself so tightly, his muscles protesting against the tension he refused to release. Even after the patrol car had moved on, its presence left an ache in his chest, a tightness that refused to dissipate. Sleep remained elusive. The hours of the night stretched thin and brittle, their silence interrupted only by the occasional creak of his old house settling on its foundations. His thoughts spiraled, tangled in memories of Marcus as a boy, his laughter bright and unfettered, the sparkle of his eyes when he would run through the yard with a stick held high like a sword. Clarence clung to those memories with a desperation that bordered on madness. The cruelty of it all was that even those precious recollections were tainted now, corrupted by the insidious doubt that had wormed its way into his heart. Was Marcus truly safe? Had his silence been born from duty, or had something far worse taken place? The letter sat there, its edges crisp and mocking, a truth he refused to confront. Clarence's health continued to deteriorate, his body betraying him in ways it never had before. Fatigue gnawed at him from the inside, his bones aching with a dull, relentless pain. Even the simple act of standing felt like a challenge some days, his legs trembling beneath the weight of a burden he could not name, and still, the officers' torment persisted. Their drive-bys became more frequent, the headlights burning into his consciousness with the persistence of a fever dream. Their actions were a poison seeping into every aspect of his life, corroding his peace of mind until all that remained was a brittle shell of the man he used to be. Yet through it all, Clarence remained resolute. This was his home, his sanctuary, the place he had built for himself and for Marcus after the cruel blow of his wife's death had left them shattered and lost. He would not be driven out, not by Reynolds or Carter or any other force that sought to uproot him from the life he had spent so long constructing. But his resolve was wearing thin, his strength eroding like stone beneath the relentless lashing of the storm. And somewhere in the back of his mind, the unopened letter continued its silent accusation, its presence a wound that refused to heal. The chill of the evening seeped through Clarence's thin jacket, its fabric little defense against the creeping cold. His steps were slower than usual, fatigue clinging to his bones like damp earth. The air was sharp, each exhaled breath curling away in delicate wisps that dissolved into the night. The corner store's fluorescent lights had felt unnaturally bright, their artificial glow only emphasizing how drained he felt. It was a small victory just to make it home these days, his limbs heavy and uncooperative, his mind clouded by the residue of restless nights. The street was unusually quiet, a hush falling over the neighborhood like an uneasy truce. Clarence's eyes lingered on the darkened windows of his neighbors' houses, their curtains drawn tight, their occupants choosing safety and silence. The isolation pressed against him, heavy and unyielding. He longed for a simple greeting, a friendly nod from someone willing to acknowledge his existence. Instead, there was only the empty expanse of pavement and the sound of his own weary footsteps. His house loomed ahead, its outline etched against the indigo sky. Relief fluttered weakly in his chest, the promise of warmth and shelter drawing him forward. But that fragile comfort shattered as soon as he saw the police cruiser idling by the curb like a beast waiting to pounce. Its engine rumbled low, a throaty growl barely contained. The sight of it sent a bolt of fear through Clarence, his pulse quickening with the unmistakable instinct to flee. But where would he go? And why should he have to run from his own home? The doors of the cruiser swung open in unison, the clunk of metal slicing through the quiet. Reynolds and Carter emerged from the vehicle, their expressions already twisted with the kind of disdain Clarence had grown all too familiar with. They moved with the deliberate arrogance of men who knew their power was absolute, who relished the opportunity to remind others of their authority. Clarence forced himself to keep his gaze steady, his shoulders pulled back even as his fingers trembled against the fabric of his jacket. Reynolds spoke first, his voice slick with condescension. The accusation of loitering came as a cold slap, the absurdity of it momentarily stunning Clarence into silence. How could anyone be accused of loitering on the steps of their own home? But the truth of it hardly mattered. It never did. The rules had never been made for his protection. They were tools of control, wielded by men like Reynolds and Carter who thrived on intimidation. Clarence opened his mouth to protest, but the words felt heavy and unwieldy on his tongue. His pulse thrummed against his temples, a frantic rhythm that threatened to drown out his thoughts. He tried to explain himself, to point out that he was simply trying to get home after a long walk, that the groceries he carried were proof enough of his intentions. But Reynolds' narrowed eyes held no interest in explanations, only the satisfaction of seeing Clarence squirm under his gaze. Carter stepped forward then, his bulk radiating aggression. His voice cut through the air, sharper and louder than necessary, designed to rattle and unsettle. The demand for identification was barked out with all the subtlety of a sledgehammer, its force leaving Clarence momentarily stunned. His hands fumbled toward his pocket, but the tremors that had become his constant companion made the simple task feel impossible. His fingers scrabbled against the fabric, clumsy and uncoordinated, his frustration mounting with every failed attempt. The wallet slipped from his grasp, tumbling to the pavement with a muted thud. The embarrassment of it stung, but there was no time to gather his bearings. Carter seized the moment, his disdain transforming into open contempt. The officer's expression was a sneer of triumph, the satisfaction of catching Clarence in a perceived act of defiance. His voice lashed out again, the accusation of deliberate disobedience twisting the air like a venomous coil. The rough shove came without warning, a forceful grip clamping down on Clarence's arm before he could react. His body collided with the hood of the cruiser, the metal's chill leaching into his skin as his chest pressed against its unforgiving surface. Pain flared along his ribs, sharp and unyielding. Carter's hands moved over him with invasive precision, the pat-down executed with a brutality that spoke of both habit and enjoyment. Clarence's breaths came shallow and fast, his chest heaving against the hood as he fought to keep his composure. Anger simmered just beneath the surface, but it was tangled with something colder, something that coiled tight in the pit of his stomach and refused to release its hold. The knowledge that his dignity meant nothing to them, that his humanity was a detail they were content to overlook, stung more than the bruises that would undoubtedly bloom beneath his skin. Reynolds remained a step back, arms folded across his chest as he watched the scene unfold with an air of casual amusement. His gaze was predatory, assessing, as if waiting for any excuse to escalate the situation further. His voice was a low drawl, mocking Clarence's efforts to explain himself, to salvage some semblance of control over his own life. Eventually, Carter stepped back, his hands leaving Clarence's body but not his space. The officer's eyes glinted with the satisfaction of a man who believed himself justified in his cruelty. His parting words were a warning wrapped in a sneer, a reminder that Clarence's existence was subject to their whims. And then they were gone, the cruiser's tires spitting gravel as they drove away, leaving Clarence hunched over the hood, his breath shuddering from the force of his own helplessness. The street was quiet once more, but the silence felt wrong, fractured and raw. Clarence straightened slowly, his body protesting the movement with a chorus of aches. His hands remained clenched at his sides, the tremors refusing to subside. The cold air scraped against his lungs, its bite a cruel reminder of his own vulnerability. Clarence stared down at the spot where his wallet had fallen, his gaze distant and unfocused. Shame, anger, and fear collided within him, their tangled threads leaving him unsteady on his feet. He was too weary to cry, too numb to lash out. All he could do was turn away from the empty street and stumble toward his front door, the keys slipping between his fingers before he finally managed to fit them into the lock. Home was supposed to be a sanctuary, but as Clarence crossed the threshold, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was merely waiting for the next storm to arrive. The afternoon sun hung low in the sky, its warmth tempered by the coolness of an early autumn breeze. Clarence moved slowly along the narrow strip of earth that bordered his modest front yard, his watering can trembling slightly in his grasp. The flowers here were a resilient bunch, their petals faded but determined, clinging to life despite the chill in the air. Their stubbornness gave Clarence something to admire, something to nurture in a world that seemed increasingly indifferent to his existence. He poured the water carefully, his eyes focused on the soil darkening beneath the gentle stream. But even in these moments of quiet routine, the unease remained. Last night's encounter had left him bruised and sore, but worse than the physical pain was the gnawing fear that had taken root within him. He could no longer deny that the officer's harassment had escalated beyond mere intimidation. Their cruelty had grown bolder, their provocations more brazen. It was a game to them, a twisted exercise of power that left him sleepless and straining to hold himself together. He had made up his mind to visit the police station the following morning. The decision had not come easily. Clarence understood the risk of filing a complaint, how easily his words could be twisted, his intentions questioned. But the alternative, continuing to suffer in silence, had become unbearable. There was only so much a man could take, and Clarence had long passed that threshold. The only thing left was to act to reclaim some shred of dignity before it was torn away completely. As the sun dipped lower, painting the sky in amber hues, Clarence let his gaze drift across the street. The houses around him seemed colder, more distant, their inhabitants hidden behind drawn curtains and locked doors. No one wanted to get involved. Fear had gripped the neighborhood as surely as it had gripped him, a collective paralysis that left everyone isolated in their own struggle for peace. Then the patrol car appeared. It barreled down the street with reckless speed, its tires spitting gravel as it lurched to a halt in front of his house. The jarring sound shattered the quiet like a gunshot. The silence ripped away to reveal the raw panic that had been festering within him for weeks. Clarence felt his heart lurch, the watering can slipping from his fingers to land with a dull thud against the grass. Reynolds and Carter emerged from the vehicle, their movements sharp and angry. Their faces were masks of fury, twisted and contorted by whatever story they had concocted to justify their latest act of cruelty. Clarence's throat tightened, his voice struggling to rise above the rapid pounding of his pulse. They hurled accusations at him, their words fired with the precision of bullets, threatening a local business owner, they claimed. The absurdity of it would have been laughable if it weren't for the venom in their voices, the certainty with which they wielded their lies. Clarence tried to speak, his words fractured and uneven, his attempt at reason smothered beneath their unrelenting anger. Reynolds advanced, his shoulders squared and his expression one of righteous indignation. The man's voice was a low growl, his words laced with the kind of authority that brooked no argument. Clarence's protests were dismissed as mere noise, his explanations ignored with a cruelty that bordered on sadistic delight. Carter's impatience flared next, his bulk closing in with an aggression that left no room for mercy. He shouted commands, his tone thick with frustration, his body language daring Clarence to do something, anything, that would warrant the violence simmering just beneath his skin. Clarence tried to keep his hands steady, tried to show them he meant no harm, but his gestures were met with suspicion. His attempts at compliance twisted into acts of defiance. The air between them was charged, thick with a tension that threatened to snap at any moment. Clarence could feel his breath coming shorter, his chest tightening under the weight of his own desperation. There was nothing he could say, nothing he could do that would satisfy them. Their cruelty had never been about justice. It was about control, about breaking him down until he was nothing more than a trembling figure cowering beneath their gaze. The first shock came without warning. Carter's taser crackled to life, its prongs embedding themselves in Clarence's chest with a force that sent his body convulsing in violent spasms. Pain tore through him like fire, his muscles seizing, his vision blurring under the assault of electric agony. His legs buckled, knees striking the ground with a sickening thud that rattled up through his bones. The world seemed to fold in on itself, the edges of reality fraying beneath the overwhelming surge of pain. But they weren't finished. Even as Clarence's body twitched uncontrollably, Reynolds stepped forward, his own weapon raised with a steadiness that spoke of experience. The second blast ripped through him, another brutal wave of electricity that left him gasping and writhing in the dirt. His hands clawed at the ground, his nails digging into the soil as if by some desperate instinct to anchor himself to something real, something that could keep him from unraveling entirely. Their voices were a blur, the words distorted and distant, lost beneath the relentless pounding of his heartbeat. He could barely make sense of what was happening, his consciousness slipping in and out of focus as his body continued to shudder under the onslaught. The pain had become something almost surreal, a force beyond comprehension, leaving him stripped of everything but the primal urge to survive. Eventually, the attacks ceased. But there was no relief, no kindness in the stillness that followed. Reynolds and Carter lingered for a moment, their gazes sweeping over Clarence's crumpled form with the dispassionate curiosity of predators satisfied with their kill. They exchanged words he could barely hear, their tones casual, indifferent. Then they turned away, their footsteps crunching over gravel as they returned to their cruiser without so much as a backward glance. The engine roared to life, the tires churning against the asphalt as the vehicle sped away, leaving Clarence's broken body sprawled across the earth. His chest heaved with shallow, ragged breaths, his vision swimming with darkness. His limbs refused to obey him, his strength drained by the viciousness of the attack. And yet, Somewhere within the fractured remnants of his mind, a single thought remained. He was still alive. But as the cold seeped into his bones and the silence settled once more, Clarence couldn't help but wonder if that was truly a blessing or just the cruelest fate of all. News of Clarence's death spreads like a cold wind through the neighborhood, carrying with it a suffocating sense of grief. The residents gather in hushed circles, their faces drawn and weary, their voices tight with anguish as they share memories of the man who had been such a gentle, reassuring presence for so many years. Clarence Hall, who never failed to wave a greeting, who offered a kind word even on his worst days, was gone. His life had been snatched away with brutal finality, his last moments poisoned by cruelty and violence. In the days that follow, flowers and cards accumulate on his doorstep like an altar to a lost patriarch. Faces are streaked with tears, eyes red from sleepless nights of sorrow and rage. Children ask their parents why Mr. Hall won't be tending to his garden anymore, and their parents fumble with words that seem too bitter to speak. The community has been wounded, the scars of Clarence's absence already etched into their daily routines. But the tragedy does not end here. Thousands of miles away, in a region defined by dust, sand, and the constant thrum of military machinery, Marcus Hall receives the news of his father's death. The message doesn't come from the police or any official channel. Instead, it arrives as a frantic call from Elijah Freeman, a longtime family friend who had seen the horror unfold firsthand. His voice is strained, cracking with grief and fury as he recounts the details. The tasers, the cruelty, the indifference. Marcus listens in silence, his expression a stone-carved mask of control. Beneath the surface, however, his mind is already blazing with calculated fury. There is a stillness to him, a precise and lethal containment of emotion born from years of leading soldiers through chaos. His reputation as a highly decorated general has been earned through a relentless pursuit of justice, his strategic brilliance matched only by the ferocity with which he dismantles those who threaten the innocent. But nothing, not the bloodiest battles or the most harrowing losses, compares to the rage burning within him now. The loss of his father feels like a blade buried deep in his chest, twisted slowly with every passing second. His hands clench into fists, his nails biting into his palms as he forces himself to breathe. The world outside his command tent blurs into meaningless noise, his focus narrowing to a singular, vicious clarity. He can almost hear his father's voice urging him toward reason, but reason has no place in the churning maelstrom of his grief. Clarence had been everything to him, a guiding light during the darkest days of his childhood, a steady, patient hand when the weight of the world seemed too heavy to bear. Marcus's mother had died when he was just a boy, leaving Clarence to raise him alone. The bond between them had been forged through hardship and resilience, a testament to their shared determination to build something meaningful out of life's relentless cruelty. And now, that bond had been severed by men who would never understand the depth of what they had destroyed. In the hours that follow, Marcus buries himself in preparations. His mind works with mechanical precision as he gathers information, contacts old allies, and crafts a plan that would ensure those responsible for his father's death would face justice. It is not the clean bureaucratic justice of formal reports and shallow apologies. It is something colder, deeper, a reckoning meant to leave scars. His reputation is not one of mercy. His enemies know him as a man who strikes with ruthless efficiency, his tactics honed by the unforgiving nature of war. Yet even they would be unprepared for the force of his wrath now. Marcus moves like a man possessed, his every action driven by a fury that threatens to consume him entirely. He pictures the officers' faces, imagines their arrogance, their casual cruelty, the way they must have looked down on his father as if he were nothing. His jaw tightens as the vision sharpens, feeding the fire already raging within him. His fellow soldiers give him a wide berth, sensing the storm gathering around him but knowing better than to interfere. As the sun sinks below the horizon, casting long shadows over the desert camp, Marcus's preparations near completion. He is not just a man seeking vengeance. He is a force, a weapon sharpened to a deadly edge by the loss of the only person who ever truly mattered to him. The men responsible for his father's death are about to discover the true meaning of terror. Marcus's arrival back home is not the reunion he once imagined. There are no warm embraces or relieved smiles. Instead, He is greeted by the chilling quiet of a neighborhood trying to move forward while its wounds remain fresh and bleeding. His flight from the base was a fog of sharpened rage and meticulous planning, his leave approved with only a nod from his superiors, who seemed more afraid of him refusing orders than the absence of his command. He steps off the plane feeling like he's landed on foreign soil. The air is thick, laced with a dread that coils around his chest and makes each breath feel labored. There's a hollow ache spreading from the center of his chest, a sensation unlike any he's endured through combat or injury. This pain is rooted deeper, its tendrils clawing into his soul. The taxi ride through the city blurs past his vision, the street names and familiar corners meaningless under the crushing weight of loss. The driver gives him glances through the rearview mirror, the man's curiosity clear but unspoken. Marcus's uniform draws stares, some of admiration, others of suspicion. But he pays them no mind, his focus narrowed to a single point. His father's house appears around the corner like a half-forgotten dream, its faded paint and modest structure unchanged yet somehow alien. Stepping out of the taxi, Marcus feels his pulse quicken. The lawn is overgrown, as if mourning the absence of the hands that once tended to it with such devotion. And there, near the edge of the walkway, the faint stain of blood mars the grass. He drops to his knees, his legs giving out beneath him, his hand trembling as it hovers above the earth. He doesn't know how long he remains there, his fingers tracing the soil as if it holds some lingering warmth of his father's presence. The neighbors watch from behind curtains, their faces ghostly silhouettes against the windows. No one comes to offer condolences. No one dares. Rising to his feet, Marcus straightens with the rigidity of a man bound by duty and pain. He forces himself to step away from the bloodstain, but not before vowing that this injustice will not stand. His father's death was a wound torn into the fabric of everything he believed in, and if those responsible thought they could act without consequence, they were gravely mistaken. His first stop is the local police station. The air inside is thick with the bureaucratic chill of authority. Officers eye him with varying degrees of unease and disdain, their posture subtly shifting when they realize he's not there to exchange pleasantries. The desk sergeant greets him with a mechanical courtesy that barely masks the indifference beneath it. Marcus's request to speak to someone about his father's case is met with deflections, the same hollow assurances of an ongoing investigation that had been regurgitated to the press. He leaves the station feeling no closer to justice than when he entered. But Marcus is not a man who waits for others to do the right thing. His training, his years of relentless discipline, have taught him that patience is a weapon best wielded with precision. And now, that patience is gone. He spends the next several days collecting information, names, records, everything he can find on Reynolds and Carter. Their disciplinary history is littered with complaints, most of which were conveniently dismissed or buried under a mountain of red tape. There are whispers among the locals, stories of harassment and intimidation that never made it past the station's walls. Marcus's investigation grows more meticulous with each passing day. His methods are not always legal, but his conscience remains untroubled. Every piece of evidence he uncovers only stokes the fire within him, his anger evolving from molten fury to something cold and calculating. He feels his father's presence urging him forward, his memory sharpening Marcus's resolve. One night, he returns to his father's house and sits in the old armchair by the window. His gaze drifts over the room, its familiar comforts now tainted by loss. A photograph on the mantel catches his eye, a framed picture of him and his father on the day of his military graduation. The pride in his father's eyes was unmistakable, a beacon of love and encouragement that had guided Marcus through every trial. But now, that beacon has been snuffed out, and Marcus will not rest until justice is served, whether through the law or his own merciless hands. Marcus approached his quest for justice with a cold, calculating precision, the kind forged by years of military discipline and battlefield strategy. His arrival at the local police station drew immediate attention, the air thickening with the weight of his presence. The officers behind the desk exchanged uneasy glances before offering their strained, insincere condolences, their words as hollow as the bureaucracy they clung to. They spoke of non-compliance, of justified force, their rehearsed statements lacking even the faintest trace of accountability. Their faces were tight, their eyes darting to avoid his penetrating gaze. Marcus saw through them with clarity sharpened by grief. The reports they handed him were filled with inaccuracies, a mockery of truth scrawled in the sterile language of official documentation. The sanitized version of events bore no resemblance to the nightmare his father had endured. His questions were met with defensive posturing, clipped answers designed to dissuade him from probing further. But Marcus's interrogation was relentless, his voice calm but steely, dissecting their narrative piece by piece. The more they tried to deflect, the clearer their guilt became. He left the station not with the closure they feigned to provide, but with his anger sharpened to a deadly edge. If the law would not deliver justice, then he would. His first step was to gather his own evidence, building his case brick by brick. The neighborhood, still in mourning, welcomed his efforts with open arms. Faces he remembered from childhood emerged from behind closed doors. Voices once softened by age now charged with righteous anger. The memories of Clarence Hall's kindness were not forgotten, and neither was the brutal injustice of his death. Witnesses recounted the horror with trembling voices, their words thick with grief and fury. Marcus listened to every account with the patience of a man who understood that truth was fragile, easily warped by fear and intimidation. But the common threads were undeniable. The officers' cruelty had been deliberate, their actions a clear abuse of power. Marcus's hands shook as he compiled testimony after testimony, the puzzle pieces fitting together with terrible clarity. Some of the neighbors had captured fragments of the incident on their phones. The footage was shaky, filled with gasps and horrified exclamations, but the brutality was unmistakable. The grainy images of Clarence's body writhing on the ground, his limbs convulsing under the electric bite of the tasers, seared themselves into Marcus's memory. It was all he could do to maintain his composure as he reviewed the evidence, his eyes burning from the sleepless nights spent combing through every detail. He moved with a quiet ferocity, his actions measured and deliberate. In his military career, he had dismantled entire operations with nothing more than intelligence and unyielding determination. This, he told himself, was no different. The enemy was corruption, its roots tangled deep within the very system meant to uphold justice. But he would not be deterred. His grief had transformed into a force more powerful than anger, something precise and unrelenting. Word of his investigation spread quickly, whispered through the community with a mix of hope and fear. His presence was both a comfort and a warning. Where the police had failed them, Marcus stood as a pillar of righteous vengeance, his dedication unwavering. The officers responsible, Reynolds and Carter, were not ignorant of his efforts. The walls they had built around their lies were crumbling, their panic becoming palpable. Marcus learned of their attempts to cover their tracks, reports doctored to conceal their misconduct, witnesses threatened into silence. But their desperation only served to fuel his determination. Every piece of manipulated evidence was another nail in their coffin, each cowardly evasion a reminder that they feared the truth he wielded like a weapon. Their evasion tactics grew more desperate. Shifts were rearranged, their presence in the neighborhood reduced to sporadic sightings, each appearance shadowed by unease. But Marcus had tracked enemies across continents. He would not be deterred by two cowardly men hiding behind their badges. He continued to collect evidence, his growing arsenal of facts and testimonies becoming a fortress of undeniable truth. The voices of the people who had loved Clarence resonated through every page of his notes, their pain echoing his own. The weight of their grief intertwined with his fury, solidifying his resolve. He would not rest until justice was served, no matter the cost. The final confrontation was drawing near, its inevitability a dark star pulling them all toward its gravitational core. Marcus's resolve had become a weapon in itself, forged from pain and sharpened by purpose. And when the moment came, he would be ready. The courtroom is silent, thick with tension as the verdict is announced. Guilty. The word reverberates through the room like a thunderclap, settling heavily on the shoulders of everyone present. Reynolds and Carter stand motionless, their faces stripped of bravado, replaced by the hollow stare of men who thought they would never face consequences. Reporters furiously jot down notes, cameras flash, and murmurs ripple through the gallery as the judge's gavel falls, sealing their fate. For Marcus, there is no satisfaction in seeing them led away in handcuffs, just a dull, aching void that justice alone cannot fill. In the days that follow, the story of Clarence Hall's death becomes a national outcry. Community leaders hold vigils, speaking his name into the chilled evening air, their voices tinged with equal parts, grief and resolve. Strangers leave flowers and handwritten notes at the gate of Clarence's house, their tributes a small attempt to mend the broken spirit of the neighborhood. Marcus watches from the window, torn between gratitude and the suffocating weight of loss. The victory feels hollow, burdened by the inescapable truth that his father will never return. Justice has been served, but at what cost? Marcus remains in his father's house for days after the trial, surrounded by silence and the faint scent of lavender that still clings to the old armchair. He moves through the rooms slowly, fingers grazing the faded wallpaper, every inch of the home a monument to his father's quiet resilience. On the mantel, the family photos seem to watch him with eyes that know too much, the glass frames reflecting sunlight in fractured patterns on the wall. The unopened letter still sits on the kitchen table, an artifact of the life Clarence left behind. It takes a week before Marcus finally gathers the strength to read it. He sits at the table, his hands steady for the first time in what feels like ages, and carefully breaks the seal. The letter is neatly written, the penmanship strong despite the years of arthritis Clarence had often mentioned. Marcus swallows hard, the words blurring as his eyes well with unexpected tears. My dearest son, I know it's been too long since we've heard from each other. I can only hope that you're safe and healthy wherever you may be. I've been thinking a lot about you lately. The garden is blooming again, and it reminds me of when you were little, digging in the dirt right beside me, determined to find buried treasure. I miss those days. I miss you. I know your work is important, and I'm proud of the man you've become. Sometimes it gets lonely here, but the neighbors look out for me. Don't worry about me. I'm just waiting for the day you walk through that door and tell me all about your adventures. Take care of yourself, son. Love always, Dad. The paper shakes in his hands, and Marcus leans forward, pressing his forehead to the worn tabletop, his shoulders trembling with the force of held-back sobs. The words cut deeper than any wound he suffered in battle, filling the cracks in his heart with regret. The thought that his father had been waiting all that time, hopeful and resilient despite the hardships, is almost too much to bear. He should have come home sooner. He should have written back more often. But now, the chance to make amends has slipped through his fingers like sand. The next morning, Marcus visits the cemetery, carrying a small potted plant, a sturdy lavender bush just beginning to bloom. He kneels before the simple gravestone, tracing his father's name with his fingertips, and places the plant at its base. He speaks softly, telling his father about the trial, about the justice served, about the ache that lingers despite it all. He confesses his regrets, his guilt, his helplessness at not being there when his father needed him most. There is a soft breeze that rustles the leaves overhead, and for a fleeting moment, Marcus allows himself to believe it is his father's spirit comforting him, offering one last whisper of forgiveness. He stays at the graveside for hours, his mind drifting through memories both bitter and sweet, until the sky darkens and the first stars prick through the twilight. When he finally rises, there is a strange calm in his chest, as if the act of sharing his pain has lightened the burden, if only slightly. Back at the house, he packs his belongings with methodical precision, preserving the most cherished items, the photos, his father's army jacket, the old gardening tools. He leaves the house just as it was, deciding it should remain a home rather than an empty shell. Neighbors promise to keep watch over it, their somber nods a quiet acknowledgement of the loss that touched them all. Marcus knows he will return someday, but for now, the world outside is calling him back to duty. As he boards his flight the next morning, he takes one last look at the town from the window, the rooftops glinting in the early light. He closes his eyes and breathes deeply, letting the memory of his father settle like a stone in his heart. The pain will never fully fade, but neither will the pride he feels for the man Clarence was, a father who taught him strength through kindness, dignity through hardship, and love through unwavering patience. The plane lifts off, and Marcus steels himself for what lies ahead. In the distance, the sun breaks through the clouds, painting the sky in hues of gold and amber. He knows that wherever his path leads, his father's spirit will guide him, reminding him to fight not just for justice, but for the compassion that Clarence embodied. As the horizon stretches wide before him, Marcus vows to honor that legacy, carrying his father's memory with him into every battle yet to come.